Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we will be covering the second set of approaches to psychology. We will be looking at personality. Within personality, we will break that down into two different domains or two different approaches to personality. We'll first be looking at Freudian theories as well as the humanistic theories, and then we will look at trait theory. So what we're going to look at today is psychoanalytic theory. We'll then look at some projective tests, some neo-Freudian psychoanalytic, and we'll finish up with humanistic theory. Before we get into the Freudian and psychoanalytic theory, let's first define personality. Since this is a section mostly about personality, I label it as personality mainly because it's easier to explain these different theories of psychology when they're looking at personality, when they're explaining personality. So personality is going to be essentially a combination of long-lasting distinctive behaviors, thoughts, motives, and emotions. So your long-lasting or relatively enduring is a word that's often used. Your relatively enduring traits, your relatively enduring behaviors, thoughts, motives, emotions, all of that is what we define as personality. When I say relatively, or when I say relatively enduring, what I mean there is that they can change, but they tend to stay the same. And it says on the slide here, long-lasting. They don't necessarily have to be long-lasting. They just have to be traits that don't tend to change. And these are these traits, again, these thoughts, motives, emotions, behaviors that are elicited when we react and adapt to other people and situations. So a theory of personality is going to be an organized attempt to describe and explain how personalities develop and why they differ. So within that, we are going to be looking at the different theories and using those theories to explain personality in a way, and that helps us to explain better what these theories are. As I said, we're going to start with psychodynamic theory. So Freud's psychodynamic theory emphasized the importance of early childhood experiences on unconscious or repressed thoughts and how we can't voluntarily access this unconscious or repressed thoughts, and how these, along with the early childhood experience, basically influence our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors, the way we behave. And that is why, again, like I said, this is, even though this chapter was done on personality, I think these theories are good to know going into it because they do influence or affect all parts of human behavior, which is thoughts, feelings, stuff like that. So when we get to cognitive psych, we'll look at how these different theories go into looking at cognitive psych. One thing that I will get to right now, and I'll just get this out of the way. I'll just say I am not a fan of psychoanalytic theory. It is what's popular in culture. You see it in movies, you see it in television, but I'm not the only one who's not a fan of it. Pretty much every research scientist, modern psychologist does not follow psychoanalytic theory. They may use some of the principles from it, but they don't follow it. At the end of talking about psychoanalytic, and when I talk about the directions that it led to, I'll come back to why psychoanalytic is good, why Freud's theory is good. But going into it, I'm just going to preface this. I'm going to go through it pretty quick. I'm going to preface it by saying that most of what I'm about to tell you in the next few slides has been disproven. There is not evidence for these things. There is some evidence out there to show that some of the things he was looking at were either on the right track or maybe correct. But in general, Freud's theory has been disproven. So Freud was very concerned with the subconscious or the unconscious. So he thought that there was a conflict going on between the unconscious and the conscious. So he thought our conscious thoughts, our wishes, our desires, our thoughts that we're aware of, that we can recall. whereas our unconscious is our wishes, desires, and thoughts that either threaten us or that we repress or that we just can't access or think about. And then that we've got unconscious motivations to refer to how these unconscious repressed thoughts and desires or impulses actually affect our consciousness and our behaviors. Now, as I said, pretty much everything Freud said has been disproven. This is one of the things that's been disproven, at least along the lines of we've got this conflict between different things and things that we repress are unconscious. He was wrong about that, but he was correct in that there is unconscious things going on, that we do have a subconscious that is actually influencing us. It's not a conflict between the conscious and the unconscious, and the things that are in our unconscious are not things that are there because they're threatening and we're trying to avoid them. It's more of there are just certain things that our brain processes at a conscious level, and there are other things that it processes at a subconscious level. So this unconscious or subconscious actually does influence behavior. We do have evidence for that. Freud also had the id, the ego, and the superego. You've probably all heard of this. Let's actually look at this in a little bit more detail. But so the id, the ego, and the superego are divisions of the mind. You already see here the id is about I want, I need. The superego is about you can't, you must not, and the ego is between them. Let's look at those individually though. The id is the pleasure seeker. It operates under the pleasure principle, meaning that it's attempting to satisfy drives and avoid pain and has no consideration or concern for moral standards, societies, regulations, things like that. And there's two main drives, that is sex and aggression. Slides changed before I intended it to, so I'll just finish talking about that on this slide. So there's two main drives of the id, and that's sex and aggression, and these are more unconscious. So the id is more of a unconscious thing. It's unconscious drives. The ego, also known as the mediator, or it attempts to negotiate between the id and the superego. So its goal is just to find acceptable ways of satisfying the id that are within the constraints of the superego. And it's mostly our conscious thought. And it operates under the reality principle, that is satisfying our wish or desire, but only if there's a socially acceptable outlet available. The superego, on the other hand, is basically our moral principle. So it develops separate from the ego during early childhood, and its goal is to apply morals and standards. So it's all about society's morals and standards, parents, caregivers, all of these. That it basically is the principle of, or the part of the mind that is responsible for moral behavior. So again, you've got these divisions of the mind, the id, the ego, and the superego. And the id is all about pleasure, the superego is all about morality, and the ego is mediating between them to try and satisfy the id while also being constrained by the superego. I can pretty much say that everything that was there, the id, the ego, the superego, they've basically been disproven, but I talk about it because it is such an important part of the history of psychology. Freud also proposed that we've got defense mechanisms. These are defense mechanisms that are an attempt to protect the ego from being overwhelmed by anxiety. So again, the ego is the conscious, so the ego is trying to mediate between this id and superego, and we've got the problems of the desires of the id. Well, the ego develops defense mechanisms to protect the individual from basically being overwhelmed by the anxiety that having these desires from the id are causing, because the superego is making the person anxious or guilty for having these desires. Got a list of defense mechanisms on this page. So I'm not going to go through all of these. These are more for your reading, but what I will say is that this is one of the things that Freud got right. And that is that we do as humans have defense mechanisms that are in place to help justify behavior or protect us from moral quandaries, that type of thing. So we do some of the things, or most of the things that are on this, not as a way to mediate between the id and the superego, but more as a way to not be overwhelmed by the things like our thoughts that maybe aren't necessarily moral. So we do rationalization, where we'll cover up the true reasons for our actions, denial, repression, projection, reaction formation, displacement, sublimation. All of these are types of things that people do, and there's way more defense mechanisms than this, more that have been identified since then. But these are things that people do in order to rationalize behavior, as well as minimize the things that maybe make them feel guilty. Freud was also a big proponent of the developmental stages. And for him, the developmental stages were what was called the psychosexual stages that you see here, the psychosexual stages. And for Freud, he had 5 developmental periods: the oral, the anal, the phallic, the latency, and the genital. In these developmental periods, what they were all about was overcoming certain challenges. So the oral phase was mainly about feeding at the time, but it was overcoming different challenges of getting fed. The anal is about potty training. Phallic is just going into them. The phallic is where children at this age are exploring their genitals and realizing they have genitals. I will say that the psychosocial stages, again, just like almost everything in Freud, has been basically disproven. We'll get to Erickson in a little bit and how he liked that there were developmental stages, but he didn't like that they were all related to sexual things. So he came up with the psychosocial stages that we'll talk about. And whereas he was still wrong about most of them, there's actually one stage in particular that he was right about. And we'll come back to that later when we're talking about personality and identity and development and things like that, and look at how Erickson's psychosocial stages influenced how we view development and identity. But back to these, you've got these stages, these psychosexual stages of Freud that emphasize the first 5 years of the life and how that was important in development. And again, like I said, he was wrong about these stages. He was on the right track, though, that early life factors can affect later life development. So what we know from what's called life history theory, which we'll talk about later when we're talking about evolutionary theory, life history theory looks at how early life factors like your home environment and the stress that's put on you on early life, how that actually affects later life developmental outcomes. So again, whereas Freud was wrong in his implementation of what he was looking at, he was actually on the right track in that the early life factors do affect later life outcomes. Freud also looked at fixation, again another thing that just hasn't been supported by the evidence. So fixation is when there's problems with these different stages, especially the first 3 stages, oral, anal, and phallic, and that's where people, because they have problems during these stages, it's what causes them a lot of behavioral issues later in life. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this just because of the fact that there's no evidence for it, so it doesn't even deserve the extra time. One thing that Freud looked at that everybody knows about is the Oedipus complex, and this is basically where boys, when they're discovering that they have genitals, and they're discovering that these genitals are a source of pleasure, and the Oedipus complex basically states that boys at this point in time become sexually attracted to their mothers, feel hatred and jealousy and competition towards their fathers, basically that they want to kill their father and have sex with their mother. Again, no evidence for this, but it is popular in media. That's why I'm talking about it. Along with that comes the Electra complex, which is basically the same thing in girls, but instead of the pleasure that comes from genitals, it's the envy that comes from girls not having a penis. Yeah. Again, no evidence for this. It's not been supported. It's kind of absurd that it was even thought of in the first place, but you have to think of the times Freud was present in and realize some of the things that Freud did and said, even beyond just his theories. So again, here we've got the penis envy in girls that makes them turn against their mothers and have sexual desire for their fathers. Again, pretty absurd. While I'm on that tangent of the absurdity that is things that happen with Freud, like many other therapists at the time, one of their therapy techniques when dealing with women was actually to masturbate the women. You might have heard about it, you might not have. They used various different devices, various different types of dildos on the women to masturbate the women, to basically, their logic was that women were hysterical. That's where the word hysterics comes from. Hysterics comes from its origins, root name is basically the uterus. So hysterics was about the uterus, it was about women, so women were hysterical, and the way to treat hysterics was for women to have orgasms. So these therapists, including Freud, basically gave their female clients orgasms to try and treat them for their psychological disorders. Pretty crazy when you think about it. It's also known that Freud did a lot of cocaine. We're not talking about a little, we're talking a lot of cocaine. It was a regular thing that he had on his desk that he did between every meeting and sometimes during treating clients. So when you look at Freud, yeah, he got us to where we are today, but he's not necessarily someone to idolize. Freud also looked at things like our techniques to discover the unconscious. So when it came to therapy, how did therapists basically measure or read or discover the unconscious desires that people have? There was 3 techniques done. Freud did 2 of them, and then later psychoanalysts added a third. But one was free association, where basically the client would just sit in a chair and talk about life and talk about things. And Freud was interested in the things they talked about and how those basically were true representation of what was going on unconsciously, and especially if they had things like what we call Freudian slips now, where the slips of the tongue, where they say something when they mean something else. Freud also did dream interpretation. Both of these, free association and dream interpretation, I should say free association is a good way that modern therapists look at kind of getting an overview of the problems people have. It's not a way to identify the unconscious, but it's a way to get an overview of the problems. So this free association is still done. Dream interpretation, that's not done because it doesn't have any evidence for working. Which gets us to the last method that was done by more psychoanalysts after Freud, and that is projective tests. So this is where an individual will look at either a meaningless object or a photo of a situation and describe what they see. And this is kind of free association taken one step farther, where they are given free association, but they need to talk about a specific topic. And it's supposed to describe both their conscious and unconscious feelings, needs, and motives. Again, like I said before, just about the other ones, there's really no evidence for this actually working. Modern therapists that use this, modern therapists still do use projective tests, but modern therapists that use projective tests actually only use them mainly as an icebreaker. They don't use them as a diagnostic tool. They use them as a way to get the patients comfortable, because they've been portrayed in media so much over the years that most patients expect these things. So because of that, it allows the patients to become more comfortable with the setting. Let's look at 2 of those tests. The first test is the Rorschach test, And the Rorschach test is basically the ink blot test. There's an ink blot like what you see over here. Then there's actually a series of 10 ink blots. This is not one of them. And they ask the person to describe what they think each image is. So again, like free association, just describing what they think this ink blot is. The other one is the TAT test, and that is where they're shown pictures of a situation. Again, what you see on the right here isn't one of them from the test, but it is basically something like what you'd see. You'd see a person with a facial expression, the sun in the background, the tree, apple tree, and now you have to describe what's happening in this picture. And depending on how the person explained about the feelings of the person or how they're feeling, stuff like that, the therapist is supposed to be able to understand better what's going on in the subconscious of the person. There are advantages to it. It can reduce some social desirability bias. It can obtain information about a person in a setting with no right or wrong answers. As I said, it's a good icebreaker. The big disadvantage is there's very big problems in scoring and interpreting the responses. So when we're talking about how good these tests are, these tests basically don't work because if you give the same test, let's say you give an ink blot test to 2 different people and you record the responses, and then you have 5 different therapists that are trained in interpreting ink blot responses. Those 5 different therapists that are trained in it, they give their diagnosis. What you're going to find is you're probably going to get 5 different diagnoses. Meaning that even though all 5 are trained in interpreting the ink blot, all 5 will say something different about the person doing the ink blot test. It just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. So psychoanalytic theory as a whole, it has poor validity. It's not testable. It's not supported by the research. It has poor reliability. It's very subjective. You looked at those when you're looking at doing a coding on somebody's responses to an ink blot test. It's very subjective. So as an overall whole, Freud's theory is not practiced today. It's psychoanalytic. You might still hear about it. Some colleges and universities might still say that they follow that domain of psychology, but in actuality, in practice, very few researchers actually use psychoanalytic theory in their research, and most of the clinicians that use psychoanalytic are ones that are over a certain age and they're basically dying off because, again, this theory is just not supported. But we can look at this question. I told you we'd come back to it. What was Freud's impact? So I pointed out a few things, like how the unconscious, even though Freud was wrong about it, it did lead us in the right direction. Things like the stages of development. He was wrong about it, but it led us in the right direction. There's a lot of things that Freud was wrong about, but it led psychologists to thinking about these things in a way that led to a more testable theory. And these testable theories were either supported by the evidence and they continued on, or they weren't supported by the evidence and they died off. So what's Freud's impact? He was basically considered by some to be a father of modern psychology, father of modern psychiatry. He was wrong about just about everything. He wasn't necessarily a great person, but at the same time, he did lead us in the right direction, and psychology would not be where it is today if he hadn't pushed so hard for his theories. So following Freud, we get to a period of time that is looked at as neo-Freudian. The next slide will even bring up that term. But Carl Jung was the first one, and he was more not just neo-Freudian, but psychoanalytic himself. He was a devoted follower of Freud. He was supposed to actually be Freud's successor, but he did split with Freud over this emphasis on sex and sex drive, because he believed that our unconscious that we have is not driven by sex, and it's not the driving force of personality and later behavior. he looked at it more of a collective unconscious that consists in humans as a whole, in how we've got memory traces and symbols passed on. Again, just like Freud, he wasn't, none of this here down at the bottom is supported at all by evidence. It's actually disproven by evidence, but at the same time, he did start to get into some of the things that we look at today, like how biological predispositions, how things like our genetics actually drive things. So when he started to talk about these ancient memory traces and symbols, he was basically talking about how we have this innate ability to learn language. And even though he was wrong on an overall whole, there are, because of biology and the way our brain is made up, we do have an innate ability to learn language. That being said, we don't share ancient memory traces other than some instincts, but we don't share ancient memory traces and symbols with everybody in society. It's more of we just have instincts from the past. This does get us into the true Neo-Freudians, that is, the followers of Freud that maintained some of his ideas but changed or renovated others. The biggest one is Erickson. I talked about him a little bit already because he changed psychosexual stages to psychosocial stages. And Freud's psychosexual emphasized those early years of life. Erickson's psychosocial changes involved all of life. And Freud had 5 stages, Erickson had 11. But the point is that even though he generally agreed with Freud on a lot of things, he disagreed on basically how biology and sexual motivations came in. So another one that disagreed on the sexual, but he also disagreed on the biological. That's one thing where we'll talk about Erickson later and how he was actually incorrect in some ways because the biological is still important. And most of Erickson's stages didn't have support, but there is one specific stage, and that is identity. Wow, that is really bad written. I won't blame you if you can't read that. But that says identity, kind of. So identity is, an identity formation is a big, important component that Erickson brought up. Okay, let's transition then from the psychoanalytic. I could talk about it longer, but I just don't think it deserves the time. Let's look at humanistic theories real quick. We only have a few slides of humanistic theories, and then we will be done with this set of slides, and you'll have to move on to trait theories. But humanistic theories are kind of interesting in that whereas the psychoanalytic were all about these subconscious and these strong desires and immorality versus morality, the humanistic theories, on the other hand, emphasize our capacity for personal growth, development, and our potential and freedom to choose our destiny. Basically, the humanistic theory looks at people as all people are intrinsically good, and we just have to reach our intrinsic goodness. We have to reach our ideal self. So there's 3 characteristics of humanistic theory. The first is the phenomenological perspective. This is that your perception or view of the world, whether it's accurate or not, becomes your reality. And this kind of gets into the first step of how humanistic theory is different than the other theories we're going to talk about. The other theories we've talked about, we're going to talk about, are much more scientific, even if psychoanalytic got a lot wrong. Humanistic theory is much more philosophical. So some don't even look at humanistic theory as a psychological theory. They look at it as a philosophical theory, but we're going to include it because it does have some good points to make. But you see this when you talk about something becoming your reality, that's more philosophical than it is psychological. But at the same time, if what your expectations are about the world or how you view the world, that is still important to psychology. Then we've got the holistic view. This is personality is more than the sum of individual parts Instead, the individual parts form a unique and total entity that functions as a unit. So the holistic view is where we're looking at basically who we are, our behaviors, our traits, our personality are all integrated. They aren't parts. They aren't individual parts. They are a sum of individual parts. Who we are isn't just individual things. Who we are is a collective unit of different things. And then finally we get to self-actualization. This is where we try to develop and reach our true potentials. And self-actualization is a very important part of humanistic theory because I already mentioned it's all about positive and that humans are intrinsically good. So this self-actualization is achieving that true potential of being good. Maslow was one of the early humanistic theorists, and he talked about this hierarchy of needs and self-actualization. So this hierarchy of needs is arranged in ascending order, with the bottom down here being the basic biological needs. So you see food, water, warmth, rest. So these basic biological needs. Then as you go up, you've still got some basic needs like safety and security, but they're a little bit beyond these basic needs. Then we get some into psychological needs like belongingness, intimate relationships, friends, prestige, feelings of accomplishment. And then at the top we get achieving one's full potential. The basic tenet of the hierarchy of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is that we must achieve the bottom steps in order to move up. So again, think of it like a pyramid, but think of it like climbing a pyramid. You need to achieve your physiological needs before you can worry about your safety needs. If you can't find food and water, you're not really worried about safety and security. You're not really worried about your friendships, your relationships. You're worried about finding food and water. Then after that, you need to satisfy the safety needs. Then you can start moving up into these psychological needs. And finally, once you've satisfied all the needs at the bottom, you can reach the top of self-actualization. So if you're stuck at any of them, if you've got a challenge at any of them, you can't move on to self-actualization. Rogers had self-theory. So I'm skipping quite a bit of it, but I do want to point out that Rogers' self-theory was looking at how we have a real self and an ideal self. So the real self is represents how we see ourselves, but how we really see ourselves and based on actual experience. Our real self is who we are. Our ideal self is based on hopes and wishes, reflects who we would like to be. And this is a thing that you see in a lot of different domains of psychology, specifically developmental, where you see this difference between the real self and the ideal self can cause problems if we don't reconcile them. And how as we get older, the differences between our real selves and our ideal selves shrink. So children, if you ask them who they want to be when they grow up, they want to be an NFL star. They want to be an astronaut. They want to be just these big things. They want to go to the Olympics. But as they grow, and they might have the potential for that. So their real self and ideal self might be close together. But in all likelihood, that ideal self, the thing they want to be, is something that's unachievable, unobtainable. So at that point in time, their real self and their ideal self are in great conflict. As they grow older, they begin to realize that this real self and ideal self are in conflict, so they shrink the gap. They bring their ideal self down towards their real self, but you can also bring your real self up towards your ideal self. So they both go towards each other. We can become better people. That's bringing the real self towards our ideal self. But we can also temper our expectations for our ideal self that brings it closer to the real self. Rogers also talked within self-theory about positive regard and how positive regard includes love, sympathy, warmth, acceptance, and respect. This is what we crave from our family. It's important to us, and we tend to get it when we do things right, but not necessarily when we do things wrong. Whereas one of the major tenets of humanistic theory is something called unconditional positive regard. Unconditional positive regard is about getting and giving warmth and acceptance regardless of people's actual behaviors. So let's say you may disappoint people. If they still show you love and acceptance and warmth, then they're showing you unconditional positive regard. If somebody does something to disappoint you, but you still show them warmth, acceptance, and love, that is you showing them unconditional positive regard. And humanistic theory really looks at how we as people should be giving more unconditional positive regard. And people as a whole, as a society, will become better if there is more unconditional positive regard given. So even those people who maybe are doing something that is frowned upon by society, even those people who are doing criminal behaviors, still being accepting of them, even if they do need to be punished, even if they do need criminal charges taken against them, but still being warm and accepting towards them is important because it makes us better as a society. So let's look real quick at the evaluation of these humanistic theories. So these theories remain very popular today because the positive view of people in the positive psychology movement that has gone on, especially recently, it's gained a lot of steam, where it's all about positivity and optimism and being positive towards others, that unconditional positive regard. So in looking at this focus on optimal human functioning, all of these still remain important. And it's got a big impact on the counseling and clinical settings, especially when we're talking about people without psychological disorders. So humanistic theory doesn't stand up as much as with treating psychological disorders. We'll talk about that at the end of the semester, but it does work really well for those who maybe are going to counseling or therapy where they don't necessarily have a disorder. When you're talking about couples counseling, or you've got low levels of depression and you go to a counselor, or you've got various different things, you've got anxiety, stuff like that, but you don't have it high enough to be diagnosed as having an anxiety disorder. Those types of things, when you go to clinical settings, counseling settings, these humanistic theories have a lot of strong support and evidence for helping. So they do, though, have low validity. They are difficult to test experimentally when we're talking about things like this positive regard and how this has an effect, and it's just difficult to test. However, they do have modest reliability. So there is some support for it, and again, it's almost like a philosophical view rather than a psychological view, but at the same time, it does have its very good uses. So, in conclusion for this chapter, we looked at Freud's psychoanalytic theory. We looked at the id, the ego, and the superego, the psychosexual stages. We looked at the projective tests. We then went some of the neo-Freudian psychoanalytic, like Jung and Erickson's psychosocial. And we finished up by looking at humanistic theory with Maslow and Rogers and unconditional positive regard. I'm sorry about my cat meowing in the background. Thank you. Come on back. Next, we're going to look at trait theory. Within trait theory, we'll define trait theory. And then after we define trait theory, we will look at some things like objective tests that are done using trait theory. All right, so what is trait theory? Trait theory isn't, again, necessarily different than the other theories in that it's a way to predict behavior, or it's a theory that overarches and says people should behave this way because of this. No, trait theory is an approach for analyzing the structure of psychological traits by measuring, identifying, and classifying similarities and differences in behavior characteristics or traits. And that's why it was utilized in the personality chapter, is because when we look at traits, one of the biggest traits we can think of is personality traits. But there are other contexts here, other things that we classify as traits that aren't necessarily personality traits. We look at behavioral traits, intelligence traits, things like that that we look at as traits. So trait theory isn't necessarily looking at one domain of psychology, it's just looking at the different domains of behavior and how can we analyze and identify these. So a trait is going to be a relatively stable and enduring tendency to behave in a particular way. So we've got behaviors, we've got traits. And again, when we look at this, this is typically what we're talking about here is personality traits. But we do have traits that we don't necessarily classify as personality. And as I already said with intelligence, some even consider intelligence to be a trait of its own that isn't personality. Okay, so let's talk about personality. And here I'm gonna throw a bunch of names at you, or a few names at you. Like I said in the first set of slides, the names are not important. I'm not gonna question you on names. It's more of, if I say such and such theory of personality stated that this, what does that mean? That's more of what I would ask. So I wouldn't ask a name specifically. I don't expect you to remember names. Especially with the book open notes, it makes it even easier. But I am going to throw a bunch of names at you right now. So first, Alport came along. Him and his grad students, they went through the dictionary and they found 4,500 traits from the dictionary that basically described personality and different aspects of people. Kettle came along, or Cattell, depending on how you hear it. He came along and he then ran factor analysis on these 45 traits. He gave surveys to a bunch of people and he ran factor analysis. Factor analysis is one of my favorite statistical procedures. I'm a big stats guy. You heard me say in a previous set of slides, I teach stats as well. I've taken, I believe, 13 or 14 stats classes total. I have an undergrad minor in stats and a graduate minor in stats. So I'm a big stats guy. I love my statistics. Well, factor analysis is one of those fun statistical procedures that is out there. So it's a statistical method that basically finds relationships amongst different items and groups them together into factors. That's where factor analysis comes in. So he ran factor analysis on these 4,500 items and came up with 35 items. So basically what that means is once you ran that factor analysis, it basically grouped 35 different factors, clusters, groups together. So all 4,500 of those traits fell into one of these 35 groups. Then he ran factor analysis again, kind of looking at it. There's different ways to run factor analysis. He ran a more strict method of factor analysis, and it came up with 16 source traits. This was still too many. It's at 4,500 is absurd, but 35 is a lot. 16 is still too many. Finally, once a different version of factor analysis got ran on it, came up with 5 personality traits. And actually, just quick tangent, because I talked about factor analysis and how much I love it. Factor analysis was actually created as a statistical procedure to measure personality as you see it here. So that's why there's different measures of factor analysis came up with different numbers of traits, because the method, the procedure of running factor analysis was developed for this specific thing. It's been used, it gets used all the time now, but one of the other big things that factor analysis has been used on is intelligence, to show that we have one factor of intelligence. But when we come to intelligence later in the semester, we'll come back to that. Those 5 traits, though, the big thing with those 5 traits is those 5 traits make up the big 5. The big 5 is our big 5 personality traits. They are the traits that make up who we are. openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Those together spell, first letter from each, spell ocean. That's how you can remember it. Modern personality theorists look at it as more than just 5. They look at probably 10. Each of these different 5 factors gets broken down into 2. We'll talk about personality more later in the semester when we're talking about identity. The whole reason I'm bringing it up now here is to show that how trait theory shaped how we look at behavior and various different things, because trait theory took and looked at all of our different behaviors and was able to basically group them together into 5 different main personality traits. So why does trait theory come in, or where does trait theory come in, and how can it actually be extended? How do we extend it to other domains? Well, trait theory also looks at things like behavioral genetics. So it looks at how genetic factors influence psychological factors, how this interaction between genetics, genetic predispositions, something we'll talk about when we talk about biological psychology in a couple weeks, how these genetic factors, genetic predispositions, interact with environment to shape who we are, to shape our personality, our intelligence, our emotions, motivation, how we behave, how we adapt, how we adjust, all of that. And what we get from this, using trait theory, is what's called heritability. A heritability estimate is a statistical measure that ranges from 0 to 1 of how much some specific cognitive personality behavioral trait is influenced by genetic factors. At 0.5, it's half genetic and half environmental. At 1, it's going to be all genetic, all heritable. At 0, it's going to be all environmental. Nearly every psychological trait that we have, nearly everything that makes up who we are, is somewhere between 0 and 1. It's not at 0, it's not at 1. It's not 100% biological or 100% environmental. It's almost always an interaction of the two. Even when we look at, intelligence is a perfect example. Our IQ has a heritability of that 0.5 there, meaning half of our intelligence is a genetic makeup, genetic predisposition, and half of our intelligence is our environment that we're in. The environment that we were raised in, the environment that we developed in, that type of thing. So heritability within trait theory and just within psychology and biology in general is heritability is what proportion of a specific trait is inherited, is genetic, and then what proportion is then environmental. And we'll later, when we're talking about biology and heritability a bit more, we'll talk about things like the diathesis stress model, which is a different way of looking at heritability and other things like that. So let's look at that kind of a little bit more for just a second though, first, and look at how environment influences behavior and how like the shared versus non-shared environment help us look at the different, how much environment and how much heritability are there. So when we look at, let's say, siblings, and we're not talking about identical siblings here, but we'll come back to that in just a second. Non-identical siblings. Non-identical siblings, let's even look at directly fraternal siblings. So fraternal siblings, meaning non-identical, there was multiple sperm, but only multiple eggs. So in fraternal siblings, they're only going to share half of their genes. 50% of their genes are shared. That is because of just the nature of probability. 50% of roughly 50% of their genes are going to be shared. We'll talk about that a bit more when we talk about the biological side, but just note that 50% of genetics are shared in fraternal twins. In identical twins, it's nearly 100%, but in fraternal twins, it's 50%. However, what you get is each sibling is going to then have different environmental factors. Even in fraternal twins who grow up in they're the same age, they have a very similar environment, you're still going to have different environmental factors. But then you're going to have differences in personality and traits based on how these different genetic factors that are inherited then interact with their environment. Even if the environment's the same, you get the different genetic factors to interact with them. However, we know from identical twins that even identical twins that share 100% of genetics, they still have slightly different environments, which results in slightly different behavioral traits and characteristics. Let's look at another thing within trait theory, and that is an important component of trait theory is objective tests. So we talked about in the last thing, the psychoanalytic in module 19, how all the psychoanalytic tests are very subjective. They're very much open to interpretation by the experimenter, by the person administering the test. Objective tests, on the other hand, are not open to interpretation. They have a specific set of rules that when people take them, they get coded a certain way. So if two people are coding a certain person that's taking a test, let's say a person takes a test, two different people interpret the results of that test, they're going to get the exact same answer, the exact same diagnosis, the exact same basically analysis, because the test is objective and there is only one way to interpret it. So the subjective tests, like those psychoanalytic tests, are subjective. They're the experimenter's subjective opinion comes in. Objective tests, there's no subjective, it's all objective, it's all coded. Perfect example of the objective test, well, besides the tests that came up with the Big Five, is the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, and we're on the MMPI-2. But in the MMPI-2 does 338 true-false statements. And people either say true or false to these statements. You can't say something else, you just say true or false. And then based on the amount of true answers for specific questions, the experimenter will assign them a personality inventory, a personality test. And this is where you get the basic different results that you can get for personality, and these are again based on objective ratings of the answers to these 338 questions. So looking at objective tests, the advantages and just trait theory in general with objective tests, the advantages is they're easily administered. They can be administered individually and groups all at once. You can have an entire room do it. You can put it online and thousands of people can do it at the same time. Scoring is very straightforward and they have very good reliability and variable validity, but pretty good validity. Sometimes you have some problems with retest. People who score one thing one day might score slightly different a week later, but at the same time, the way that they are interpreted by the experimenter is consistent from one day to the next, from one experimenter to the next. The disadvantages, though, they may show some social desirability bias. What that means is some participants may answer in a certain way, not how they feel, but because that's the way that they're expected to answer, or the way that it's socially desirable. So there are some issues with the subconscious feelings, things like this. You can still do objective tests that get at subconscious, but most of the objective tests have these problems of social desirability. And one of the big issues is predicting. Is it predicting behavior in across in general, or is it only predicting it in specific situations? So this is where you get to the debate between domain general and domain specific. Domain general means something is the same in all domains, in all situations. Domain specific means it's different in different situations, different domains. So it's just one of the things to consider when dealing with objective tests. I just kind of want to finish with something a little bit amusing. People talk about this in psychology, and it's something that if we were in the room together, I might even give you a horoscope reading and show you how the Barnum principle is really, how utilized it is or how prevalent it is, and how you can see how easily some people are persuaded that some of these things that really have no support in research actually get adopted by people. So horoscopes, they're read by a large percentage of men and women, and many people believe that horoscopes are so correct that they were written for them. But this is actually the Barnum principle. These tests have very low reliability and validity. What ends up happening is that these horoscopes tend to list so many general traits that almost everyone who reads the horoscope will think it's about them. And because these traits are so general, they apply to almost everyone. The test that's always amusing to do, and it tends to be done in intro psych classes, so I said if we were in person I might do it, is everyone, I would find out everyone's birthday, and then I would give everyone a horoscope based on their birthday. And without sharing it with your neighbors, I would ask then, okay, how much does this apply to you? And what ends up universally happening in these, when this is done in big classes, the majority of people in the class will say that that horoscope applies to them, that it was very accurate. It is then revealed that everyone received the exact same horoscope, regardless of their date of birth. Everyone receives the exact same horoscope, the exact same wording. And the majority of people before that believed that that horoscope was accurate and was written for them. And that comes back to this Barnum principle and how when things are written in a certain way, we tend to notice the things that confirm confirmation bias, and we ignore the things that don't confirm what we're thinking. There's just a little interesting aside when it comes to different tests, and we'll talk more when we talk about things like memory and how easy it is to affect memory and how easy it is to implant false memories and stuff like that. But for now, just note that there's definitely some things out there that piggyback on or utilize some of our psychological processes in such a way to fool us, to trick us. We'll talk about even like illusions and stuff like that, and how they utilize the way our brain processes vision to make us think we're seeing something we're not. So in review, we looked at trait theory, we looked at factor analysis in the Big Five, we looked briefly at genetics, looked at some objective tests, the MMPI, finished up there with horoscopes. But like I said, this is a short chapter. I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of how trait theory is utilized in psychology, so when we're going throughout the semester, you can see trait theory at work. Thank you. Come on back.